How are we going to solve the new security challenges in the 21st century? If you look at where we're going to be in another 20 years, around 2030 or thereabouts, the population is going to be 20% larger, energy demand is going to be 30% larger, and the global economy is going to grow by 140%. That's the demand on the system. The governance structure that we have is going to devolve from governments down to empowered individuals and to coalitions, essentially, not government-dominated. That assessment, especially the last part about what's going to happen in global governance, is not my analysis. That is the assessment of the United States intelligence community. They have determined that the global system is going to be radically changed over the next 20 or so years. So how are we going to deal with this problem? What we are facing is a series of transnational problems that exist today, but that we don't have very good structures for dealing with. So for example, nuclear security, cybersecurity, infectious disease, biosecurity, financial instability and interdependence, all of those things, non-state actors, terrorism, all of those things are key elements that we now have to face, but we don't have the infrastructure to deal with it. So what do these problems have in common? They cross borders, they impact global economies, and they affect the established international order. So there's no government, there's no institution, there's no non-governmental organization that can deal with these problems alone, but we don't yet have the sufficient interaction among countries and among the other key players to address these problems yet. So we have to think about what is the method by which we're going to address these problems, because in part, one of the things we have to think about is this is where technology and politics intersect. And that's an extremely volatile intersection because the cost of climate change, for example, is enormous. And companies don't want to bear it, and governments are not sure that they can bear it. But we're pretty sure that it's not going to get any better unless we do something about it. So let me try to lay out my thinking about these issues and some of the principles that I've used in the past and that I think are applicable into the future. I like to think about solving these problems like a mosaic. At the end of the day, when you look at a mosaic, it's a very, very beautiful picture, but it's made up of thousands of smaller pieces. So the first principle is you can't take pieces of glass or ceramic and just willy-nilly put them together and hope that you're going to end up with the picture that you want at the end. You have to know in your mind what it is you want that picture to look like. So I think for all of these problems, what we need to understand is we need to know where we want to end up. And then we need to figure out how to work backwards to get to that specific outcome. So some of the principles that I like to use are cross-pressuring the system. What does that mean? There is no one path. Doing things on a government-to-government basis alone, or just in the non-governmental community, or just within a specific industry set, doesn't work. You have to be able to put various cross-pressures on the system to try and drive a result. Opportunity. Opportunity is essentially the transmission line for success. You need to find your opportunities, and you need to make your opportunities. And both of those things are very important. Starting small. Some of the stories I'm going to tell today are about starting small and growing large. So don't be afraid to take a toehold and a simple victory and then grow it out. Because what you need to do is think big. That's what this is all about. These issues are not about technology, technologists, or scientists. They're about us and how we as a global community are going to live and interact. And then finally, I think what some of these principles say is they're not just applicable to security problems on a global basis, they're also applicable in life. So let me give 2 stories about how these principles worked in my experience, both inside the government and outside the government. It starts when I was outside the government, in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and our government, the United States government, was concerned about loose nukes, what they call loose nukes in the former Soviet states. And what that meant is Russia has the biggest nuclear arsenal, it has the biggest amount of nuclear material, has the most scientists, the most facilities. And in the meltdown after the collapse of communism, it wasn't clear that there was adequate control. So I was sitting on the outside from my perch looking at what was going on inside the government. And what they really wanted to do was to be able to get an initiative or an kind of cooperation with the Russian government to lock down the nuclear materials that they thought could migrate to a terrorist organization or to a country that has nuclear weapons ambitions. And I was at an event, and there were a bunch of government people there, and I said, I'm not sure I understand why you guys aren't making progress. And that person said to me, well, you don't have a security clearance and you don't have a government job, so you can't really understand what's going on. And then a few months later, I was inside the government. And I was able to take some of the thinking that occurred outside the government and apply it inside the government. So what did we do, or how did we do it? The first thing we did is we let the government bureaucrats essentially continue to wrestle in the territory that they felt most comfortable wrestling. And we took the nuclear scientists from our country and we intensified their interaction with the nuclear scientists from Russia. The second thing we did is that we created incentives, financial incentives and reputational incentives for the scientists and the cities that they lived in to try and put pressure on their government, to cross-pressure their government to try and get something done. We decided that our best opportunity was one facility at a nuclear installation that right after World War II had been well outside of Moscow. Now it was literally within the city limits. And there was one building, Building 116, that we knew had a collection of weapon-grade uranium. So we decided that Building 116 was going to be our breakthrough and our opportunity. I went to that facility, and I was quite surprised. It was overgrown outside, trees and weeds. I walked inside, there was no monitor, no metal detector. You walked down the hallway, there was one light bulb about every 20 feet. But you went down the stairs, and you were faced with this enormous vault door. Big as a bank vault, maybe even bigger. And on that vault door was this tiny little skeleton lock. And behind it was what we were after. So the superintendent came down, and he fished out his scrum of 30 or so keys, and he opened it up, and he pulled the door back, and we walked in, and on one side of the room were a bunch of windows, no bars, sunlight streaming through. On the other side was what looked like a set of red gym lockers. And across each one of those lockers was a string. And attached to each end of that string was a wax seal. And that was on each and every one of these gym lockers along the side. So we all sat down at this table, and inside the table, on top of the table, was this long metal, semi-hollow piece of metal. And so one of the people from this facility went over, and they opened up the locker door, and they brought out this gleaming stainless steel tube that was filled with weapon-grade uranium. Wasn't very big, it was only about that big. And they put it on the table in that semi-hollow piece of metal. And they said, okay, this is what you guys are concerned about. What are we going to do about it? And so over a 9-month period, we worked with them together, not dictating to them or telling them what they needed to do because it's what we did, but working together, we made a model facility for security at Building 116. And then they invited everybody else from around the nuclear complex in Russia to come and see what they had done. And it was like a light bulb going off. And everybody wanted it. And so the people in Moscow, the government people, the bureaucratic people, who still, I think, had a very much of a Soviet mindset, could not say no, because it was something that needed to be done for their international prestige. There was money associated with it, and it's what their people wanted. And so that's how you cross-pressured the system. And now, virtually every facility in Russia has modern security. That incident that has exploded over the last 20 years or so is exactly what this nuclear summit is built on. Without that one toehold at Building 116 in Moscow, we wouldn't be here this week and into next week talking about how to globally cooperate on nuclear security, because what it did is it proved the principle, even though it was a small success. So let me just tell another short story from outside the government. This time I really was outside the government and I wasn't going back in. What we saw was an opportunity in this nuclear security summit process that the United States initiated. But what we also saw was a lack of ambition. And what we wanted to do was make sure that we matched the opportunity with sufficient ambition. And we saw that the current system for managing nuclear security and for building international confidence among all nations, that there are no weak links in the system, didn't exist adequately and needed to be improved. So we put together, myself, my colleagues, a list of activities and initiatives that should be taken. And we put it forward to a variety of different countries. And a reaction from the United States government was, I would say, swift and extremely negative. They said, you are chasing rainbows. You are rainbow chasers. These things can't be done. But we were undeterred. And we brought together a group of people that used to work in government in other countries, other governments that had a more positive view of what it is that we were saying. And together, we pushed this agenda forward from the last summit in Seoul in 2012 up to this summit in The Hague in 2014. And what happened is, all of a sudden, we started seeing stories about how the United States government thought that some of the ideas that were being put forth were good ideas. And I think we're going to see at this summit in The Hague steps toward that objective. So my point is, you can't use one channel. You can't be deterred. You can't start and look at the top of your shoes and take one step at a time. You have to know where it is that you're going. So how are we going to use these principles to deal with other problems that we have? To me, in this transnational security area, the biggest challenge we face is the intersection of energy growth, climate change, and the expansion of nuclear power. And the three of them are all interrelated. So the expansion of nuclear power is occurring in developing countries, and it's also occurring in volatile regions where there's not deep culture of security and not a deep level of expertise. The upside of nuclear, because nuclear is going to be with us for a long, long time. The upside of nuclear is that it provides you with a steady source of electricity. So when you plug your cell phone in at night before you go to bed, it's charged in the morning. When you plug in the laptop and you work with your children to do their homework, your laptop is powered. You don't worry about whether or not it's polluting the atmosphere because it's a steady source of electricity. But there's a downside to nuclear, because nuclear is a really special technology that's a double-edged sword. And the downside is accidents, It's terrorism, both cyber and physical. It's the use of nuclear weapons materials to produce electricity, and it's actually nuclear weapons themselves. So those are issues that we need to manage, and we need to manage them in a better, more comprehensive way than we are today. Because at base, radiation does not respect borders, and what we have is a global challenge, and we need to deal with it in a global way. And global security is about secure society. And secure societies are the foundation of economic growth, opportunity, and global progress.